I looked at my dad's bank account and saw nearly $600 million in it. I thought to myself, this money is all mine now. I don't need you anymore. After my kind father-in-law passed away, I was still grieving when my husband came to me and casually dropped the news that he wanted a divorce. It turns out he was only showing his true colors after getting his hands on the $600 million inheritance from his father. He saw me as nothing more than an ATM, just waiting for Dad to pass away so he could live a lavish life without having to work. I had seen glimpses of his true nature before, but I never realized he was this awful. Before I knew it, I was clenching my fists, angry at myself for being fooled into this marriage. I could accept being deceived, but I couldn't stand him speaking badly about my kind father-in-law. Fine, I said, hand me those divorce papers. I snatched the papers from my husband, signed them quickly, and threw them back at him. All right, the rest is up to you, I told him. Yeah, leave it to me, he replied, smugly. He offered to send my belongings, and I walked past him, out of the living room, and left the house. I knew my husband would regret divorcing me. Sure enough, he called me later, panicking when I explained that the $600 million was just a fantasy. My name is Mary, I'm 45 years old, and I work in sales. My husband John is also 45, and he used to work in sales, but now stays at home. There's a story behind him becoming a homemaker, but to explain that, I should start with my first husband. This is my second marriage. My first husband died in a work accident 5 years ago, leaving me a widow. Between life insurance and severance pay, I received about $600,000. Since my first marriage happened later in my 33s, we didn't have any children. I inherited the money along with my ex-in-laws, but they told me, we're almost 82 years old and don't have much time left, so we don't need it. I couldn't accept that and decided to give the money to my ex-brother-in-law and his wife, who were living with my ex-in-laws. However, they also said, we don't need much since it was my brother's money. You should use it, so they only took a small portion of the money. In the end, after paying a significant amount in inheritance taxes, most of the money ended up with me. Combined with our savings and the fact that I had a job, I became fairly well off by the age of 41. But even with all that, sitting alone at home and looking at the numbers in my bank account, I felt empty. When I came home from work, no one was there, and no one ever would be. The bed beside me stayed perfectly made, just as it was before I went to sleep. The worst part was when I accidentally made breakfast for two. As I took a bite of the second piece of toast, I thought, this must be what it feels like to have a hole in your heart. I really wanted to take some time off, but I had to keep working, so I went back to my job with this emptiness inside me, constantly feeling a sense of void. I desperately wanted someone, anyone, to listen to me, and that someone turned out to be my current husband. When I told him about my husband passing away and how I had to take some time off because of it, he said, I'm sorry for any inconvenience. I quickly replied, No, it was no inconvenience at all. Besides, your husband was a lucky man to have someone who cared for him so much. I'm sure he was very happy. He then shared a bit about himself, saying, as for me, I'm terrible at relationships. Even when I do date someone, I get dumped quickly. I know it's because of my careless personality, but it seems hard to change who you are. My husband and I were business acquaintances before we got to know each other better. I knew he was a cheerful person, so when I visited his company, I ended up telling him everything. Normally, anyone would find such a dark and heavy story off-putting, but he listened quietly and then cheered me up with some light-hearted jokes. His words and smile seemed to fill a bit of the hole in my heart. He continued to listen to my stories, and we started meeting outside of work. One day, while we were talking, I accidentally dropped a receipt, and he jokingly said, Wow, my wallet is twice as thick with coins. You dropped a receipt, and we both laughed. I need to organize it, but it's such a hassle. When he tried to pay at a store, receipts started falling out as he pulled out some cash. I picked up the receipts and handed them back to him, and he stuffed them back into his wallet, complaining about the coins. It seemed like the receipts were also making his wallet bulky. "You're like a kid, John," I teased. "What? I'm 45, you know," he replied. Just as he said, he was a bit careless, but watching him, I felt the hole in my heart slowly start to close. We kept meeting privately, and a year later, he told me he had feelings for me. It had only been a year since my previous husband passed away, so I was torn, but I felt like my late husband was telling me, "Don't stay stuck, move forward." So I decided to start dating John. People around us had their opinions, but making that important decision helped me begin to heal. However, just a month later, John gave me an even bigger concern and asked me to make an incredibly important decision. Shouldn't we get married? Given our age, it's better to decide sooner rather than later. This time, I couldn't hear my late husband's voice guiding me. It felt like he was telling me to trust my own intuition and keep moving forward, so I decided to marry John. "Okay, let's get married," I said, surprising even myself with how quickly I made that decision. It was likely John's personality rubbing off on me. I started to think that a bit of carelessness wasn't so bad if it made me more positive. At the same time, I learned from John that too much carelessness could be problematic. "Wait, live with your dad?" I asked. "Yeah, just recently, he got sick and needs help with daily living. He kept working past 73, thinking he was still young, and now this happened." "What about your mom? Is she helping him?" "Huh, didn't I mention it? My mom's not around. My parents divorced when I was young, and I haven't seen her since. This is the first I'm hearing of it. Sorry, don't be mad, but it's a heavy topic to bring up when we weren't sure about getting married yet, right? I figured I'd tell you later. Even if you put off talking about living together, you could have told me about your parents. I would have known that living together might be an option." "Well, let's not sweat the small stuff. Just meet my dad and then decide if you're okay with living together. And if I say I can't live with him, we'll figure it out then," John said with a smile, but I couldn't smile back. "I'm not planning to say I don't want to marry you just because I don't want to live together. I just wish he had told me the important things earlier. I thought being careless wasn't so bad, but now I see it's not a good thing after all." In the end, I agreed to meet his father, as John suggested. Then I began to understand what he meant by small stuff. "Your house is pretty big," I said. "Just a bit. It's just me and Dad, so we have some extra rooms. If you move in, you can use any of the spare rooms," John replied. I was about to meet his dad for the first time, so I was a little nervous. Ignoring my feelings, John opened the gate and walked towards the front door. His house was 3 stories high, slightly bigger than the neighboring houses. Living there with just the 2 of them seemed quite luxurious. That's what I thought, but John seemed dissatisfied. "Dad's so stingy. He should have built a bigger house," he muttered to himself. But I was too nervous about meeting his dad to confirm what he said. "Dad, I brought her. This is Mary," John said. "Nice to meet you," I said. "Sorry to greet you from bed. It's been hard to move lately," his dad replied. "Please don't strain yourself," I said. John's father propped himself up with John's help. He wasn't bedridden, and it seemed he could get up and walk slowly with a bit of help, so he could manage with some assistance. Despite his physical issues, his father seemed sharper than I expected. "So, Mary, you're in sales for office equipment. With the move to paperless offices, selling the hardware must be getting tougher, right?" his dad asked. "Yes, industry-wide, equipment sales have been declining for about 11 years, so everyone is focusing on new services or business expansion," I replied. "Considering that the domestic market for the equipment is almost saturated, you need to look at countries where there's still demand for new services. IT integration might be the way to go. I think there's something called MPS, right?" he said. I completely forgot I was talking to my future father-in-law. The conversation flowed so naturally into work talk that I switched to work mode. His father didn't push too hard on the marriage topic either. He was probably being considerate of my feelings. After just a few minutes of talking, I found myself respecting him. I started to understand why John called living together small stuff. He probably knew I wouldn't oppose living with his dad. About 30 minutes into our conversation, his father said, "My back's starting to hurt. Sorry to cut this short, Mary, but I need to rest. Please take care of John. He's quite a chatterbox." "Sure, I will," I replied. Is sure the right response. His father seemed to cut the conversation short to avoid burdening me. I wanted to talk more, but I didn't want to tire him out. Feeling a bit disappointed, I left with John. On the way back, John told me more about his dad. "Dad's a serial entrepreneur," John said. "A serial what?" I asked. "A serial entrepreneur. He starts companies, grows them, then sells them. He's done it multiple times," John explained. "You can just buy and sell companies like that." I was surprised. Well, yeah. Selling one company involves millions of dollars. Starting and growing a company also needs a lot of money, so the sale isn't all profit. But still, Dad's pretty well off. He just doesn't like to spend. He could build a mansion that would make jaws drop, but he doesn't, John said. "Don't you know much about his work?" I asked. "He doesn't talk much about work or money. He never hired me for his companies or taught me how to make money. Living at home is the only way he spoils me. If he's got so much money, he could spoil me a little more, don't you think?" John replied. "Your dad probably has his reasons," I said. It seemed his father was quite an impressive person. It made sense that John might feel overshadowed by him. Given how incredible his father is, John probably got compared to him a lot, so it's understandable that he'd have some complaints. "By the way, why did your mom leave? Your dad seems so kind. It's hard to imagine their marriage not working out," I asked. "Mom spent a lot and wanted an easy life. After the divorce, people only came after Dad's money, so he decided never to marry again. He focused on work instead. With that much money, he could have spent a bit, don't you think?" John answered. "I don't believe in spending money just because you have it," I said. From what John told me, it seemed his mom relied on his father's money, so I couldn't agree with John on this point. But I think his words came from feeling inadequate compared to his father. Later, I talked with John about living with his father. His father currently relies on John for help and also gets assistance from a home helper when John is at work. I thought my husband and I would continue working while getting help from a home assistant to take care of my father-in-law. However, John surprised me with a different idea. "I want to quit my job and take care of Dad," John said. "What? Quit your job?" I was shocked. "Dad's such an incredible person, right? I feel like I haven't done anything for him all this time, so from now on, I want to support him without relying on a caregiver." "I'll be like a homemaker," John explained. "I'll take care of the house too," John said. "Are you sure you won't regret quitting your job?" I asked. "I'd regret not doing anything for Dad more. I can go back to work after he's gone," he replied with a small smile. "That joke isn't funny," I said, feeling worried. I thought my husband might resent his father, but it turned out that wasn't the case. Despite everything, he really cared for his dad. "If you're going to be a homemaker, you better handle the housework properly," I warned. "Leave it to me," John said, puffing out his chest confidently. Since my father-in-law would cover his own expenses and my income would be enough for the two of us, I decided to leave the housework to my husband. When we got married and started living together, everything went as planned. I worked and John took care of the house. He managed the chores, handled the finances, and supported his dad. When I tried to help, he would say, "You're tired from work. I'll handle the house stuff. You rest." My father-in-law remained kind and shared many valuable stories with me. Our second marriage was going well. However, I noticed that my father-in-law would sometimes frown when he saw John doing housework. A month after we started living together, John began slacking off with the house chores. "You're sleeping on the couch again. You've been there all day, haven't you?" I asked. "No way. I went to the fridge when I was thirsty and to the bathroom too," John said, trying to defend himself. "That's not what I mean. What about dinner? Did you go grocery shopping?" I asked. "Dinner's ready. Don't worry," he replied. I glanced at the kitchen, but there was no sign of any cooking. All I saw was an empty container on the dining table. It was clear he had been lazy all day. From this, I realized what John meant by "dinner's ready." Perfect timing. The intercom rang, and John grabbed his wallet and headed to the door. I was too stunned to say anything. John had only handled the housework diligently for the first 3 weeks. After that, he gradually stopped doing anything, and I ended up cooking, cleaning, and doing the laundry. It's typical for someone with a careless personality to start strong and then quickly slack off. Caught up in the excitement of getting married, I hadn't foreseen this. My father-in-law, on the other hand, must have predicted it early on, which is why he frowned when he saw John doing housework. As my husband began to shirk his duties, my father-in-law started apologizing to me, saying, "That boy is so careless. I'm really sorry, Mary. I hoped he'd become more responsible after getting married, but it seems he's just causing you trouble. If he becomes a burden, feel free to kick him out." I wouldn't do that. "Really, it's okay. I'm sorry. I've tried to correct him, but he's just, well, you know." "It's okay, but he isn't neglecting to help you, right?" I asked. "No, he does help me, at least a little," I replied, noticing a slight change in my father-in-law's expression. It was clear that John wasn't completely ignoring his father, but he also wasn't doing a third job. Still, my father-in-law was probably downplaying the situation to avoid any conflicts between us. "I'm sorry," I said. "No, Mary, you don't need to apologize," my father-in-law replied. With just one word, "sorry," he seemed to understand what I was feeling. We both apologized, and there was a bit of awkwardness between us. To break the tension, my father-in-law quickly changed the subject with a brighter tone. "Oh, I'm doing some end-of-life planning and need your help. I'm not confident in John handling it." "End-of-life planning? It's not as negative as it sounds. I just want to avoid any trouble later." "Got it. If there's anything I can do, I'd be happy to help." Talking about John made us both cautious, so we ended up avoiding discussions about him and housework. It was an uncomfortable way of being considerate, but there were also thoughtful gestures that made me happy. "Is there anything inconvenient at home?" my father-in-law asked. "Not really, but the bathroom could use some fixing. I had just wanted the water heater checked," I said, but my casual comment turned into something much bigger. "Wait, what's this?" I exclaimed when I saw the changes. My father-in-law had contacted a contractor he knew, and they completely renovated the bathroom. Not only were the tub and shower replaced, but the walls and floors were redone with special coatings to resist grime, and the drain was redesigned to make cleaning easier. They even installed a bath lift to help my father-in-law get in and out easily. "Now I can enjoy a nice clean bath, and it's easier for me to get in and out," he said. It was an extravagant use of money, and this happened a few times where a small request turned into a huge upgrade. I learned not to ask my father-in-law for small favors lightly, yet my husband still called him stingy. I couldn't understand how John could see it that way, given how generously his father spent money. Out of curiosity, I asked my father-in-law about his most extravagant spending. "What's the most luxurious thing you've ever done?" I asked. "I started a seafood company in Germany, built the office and the factory from scratch. That cost a fortune." "A company in Germany? That's impressive, but it was work, right?" "Well, yes and no. I did it because I wanted to, so it was more like a hobby." "Why seafood in Germany? Was it because it was profitable?" "No, I had no knowledge or connections and didn't think about profits. Germany exports a lot of seafood, and we import a lot of it. I love seafood, so I thought I could make money and eat all the food I wanted, he said, looking happier than I'd ever seen him. He must have really enjoyed that time. But if he just wanted seafood, he could have bought as much as he wanted. Starting a company overseas seemed extravagant. Do all successful people think this way? It's a world far beyond the understanding of an ordinary person like me. It made me realize that my father-in-law wasn't stingy. He was just careful about when and where to spend money. My husband just didn't understand that. One day, my husband burst into David's room and vented his frustration at both of us. You listened to Mary's requests, but not mine. Are you talking about the bathroom? You use it too, right? And since cleaning is easier now, it's a big help to you as a homemaker, right? Mary gets to enjoy a nice bathroom, and it's convenient for me too. No one loses here, David replied calmly. My husband clicked his tongue loudly and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I'm really sorry, I said. It's fine, but why don't you listen to your son's requests? I asked. He's like his mother. When he has money, he spends it without thinking. Even with a lot of money, you need to understand its value and how to use it wisely. I've tried teaching him that many times, but he's still the same, David said, his expression turning somber. Since that day, my husband had become even more neglectful. Not only did he stop doing anything around the house, but he started causing unnecessary trouble. Whose motorcycle is that outside? Did you buy it? No one else's motorcycle would be here. I yelled at my husband as soon as I got home from work, but he just polished an expensive-looking golf club in the living room without even looking at me. My husband had stopped doing housework and started buying whatever he wanted. I wouldn't complain if he was spending his own money, but he was using my bank account without permission. You get your requests granted by Dad. Let me have a bit of luxury too, he said, trying to justify his actions. He had been diligent as a homemaker at first, and I hadn't seen this lazy side of him before we got married. It seemed he had been hiding his true self before marriage. I was completely fooled. When we got married, I told my husband, if my salary isn't enough for our living expenses, feel free to use the money in my account. I took back my bank book so he couldn't use the money without my permission. When I checked it, I saw he had spent around $50,000 in just 3 weeks. It was an expensive lesson that I couldn't trust him. Naturally, I thought about divorcing him, but I didn't want to leave my father-in-law in his care, so I erased divorce from my list of options. My husband seemed to sense that I wouldn't divorce him and became even more arrogant. Hey, can't you come home earlier? I've been waiting for dinner all this time, he complained, treating the living room sofa like his personal nest and hardly moving from there. Of course, he did no housework at all. What does being a homemaker mean? I was starting to lose my understanding of it. He had said he didn't want to rely on a home assistant and wanted to be a good son, but he ended up hiring a caregiver again. Honestly, this made me feel better knowing my father-in-law wasn't left to my lazy husband. I decided to avoid my husband as much as possible, thinking, let sleeping dogs lie. With this mindset, the year flew by quickly. Then a significant event happened for both me and my husband. Thank you for everything. My father-in-law passed away just before turning 81. The time I spent with him was short but incredibly meaningful to me. It felt like we had spent 11 years together. Even after the funeral, I couldn't pull myself together and felt a deep void in my heart. As I sat in the living room, lost in emptiness, my husband walked in with a cheerful expression. Hey, let's get divorced. What? That single word snapped me out of my daze. He was waving the divorce papers in my face. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a joke. I found Dad's bank account. Guess how much is in it? Nearly $600 million, so this money is all mine. You're no longer needed, ATM. When Dad collapsed a year ago, I didn't want to deal with taking care of him, so I looked for a wife. I figured you'd be an easy catch since you were grieving the loss of your previous husband. I see, so that's why you were in such a hurry to get married. That's part of it, but then I changed my strategy. You inherited money from your late husband, right? You never talked about it, but I figured his retirement and insurance would be substantial. I took care of Dad while you acted as the ATM until he passed away. It was easier than working. Now that Dad's gone, I'm set for a lavish life with his inheritance. Do you think you can get away with this? I asked, feeling the anger rising. Of course, I'm his son, so it's only natural I inherit his wealth. He worked until he collapsed, and I thought he'd live until 87, but he died sooner than expected, so I'm lucky, he replied smugly. I realized I was clenching my fists. It was my fault for being tricked into marrying him, and I could accept that. But I couldn't forgive him for speaking so badly about my kind father-in-law. I was ready to punch him, not caring about the trouble it might cause later. But then I felt like I heard my father-in-law's voice saying, "Stay calm." Right? There was no need to do anything rash. Are you sure about this? All right, give me the divorce papers, I said. I snatched the papers from my husband, signed them on the spot, and handed them back. Thanks for making this easy. I'll file these tomorrow. You can take all our savings. I've got $600 million, so take as much of that petty cash as you want, he said, clearly gloating. Okay then. Yeah, leave it to me. I'll file the papers and send you your stuff if you want, I replied, walking past him and out of the house. As I left, my anger started to fade, and I felt a wave of laughter rising. My husband would soon regret divorcing me. That $600 million was just a pipe dream. A few days later, while staying at a hotel and looking for a new place to live, my ex-husband called. Hey, what the hell did you do? He yelled. I instinctively pulled the phone away from my ear as he started shouting. He seemed confused, so I needed to explain what was happening. I can guess what happened, but why don't you tell me? I asked calmly. When I tried to withdraw money from Dad's account, they said this money can't be withdrawn. What's going on? There should be $600 million in there, he said, his voice full of frustration. Looks like you didn't know. Since your dad didn't spoil you, you never took an interest in his affairs, right? And he never discussed his work with you, I explained. Stop with the riddles. There's money, right? He demanded. Yes, there's $600 million, but it's collateral, so you can't touch it, I replied. Collateral? He asked, his voice shaking. That's right. The money is in the account, but it's untouchable, like a pie in the sky. Also, that money is about to be used to pay off debts, so it'll be gone soon, I explained. You're kidding. There's $600 million, and I can't use any of it. His voice grew quieter as he started to panic. I knew about the $600 million being collateral because I knew about the $600 million being used as collateral because I helped with my father-in-law's end-of-life planning. He had asked me to handle things if anything happened to them. Since he passed away, I was going to use the $600 million to settle his debts. But since my ex suddenly demanded a divorce, I left the paperwork to him, telling him to take care of the rest. What did Dad do with the $600 million? My ex asked. He used it for something he loved, I replied. What does that mean? He asked, confused. At over 72, Dad decided his next job would be his last and used his savings for something he enjoyed, that seafood processing and distribution company in Germany he always talked about. He trusted the management to locals and planned to enjoy his retirement here, but it was a huge failure, and he lost almost everything. When he told me about it, he laughed, saying it was only natural since he did it without any real knowledge. He had no regrets about where he spent his money. To start that company, he borrowed $600 million, using his savings as collateral. But it turned into debt, so he planned to repay it with another job. It seemed impossible, but he didn't think so. Even with the debt, he kept enough money for his retirement. In today's world, where many struggle in retirement, it's impressive. However, while sorting out the Germany company, his health declined. When that happened, he renegotiated his repayment plan with the bank. Given his long history of high-value transactions, they trusted him. He told them, "If I can't work anymore, take the collateral." They agreed to a 2-year grace period, after which the debt would be paid off with the collateral if he couldn't work. That year is up, and it's time to settle the debt. So this $600 million is debt repayment money, and will soon be zero. My ex asked, his voice filled with shock. Exactly. Didn't you find another bank account? There should be one for living expenses. Yeah, I found one with $80,000 in it. That's money you can use freely. It's your inheritance. $600 million turned into $80,000. Why didn't he prepare more for his retirement? My ex wondered, clearly surprised. I was surprised by the $80,000 too, but knowing him, he probably planned to add more if needed. He seemed capable of anything. And it looks like you haven't checked the will yet. Will? Dad told me he'd leave me about 20%, my ex said. We're divorcing, so you could contest it as infringing on your rightful inheritance, but I'd like to honor his wishes. I hope you'll agree to the 20%, I said, noticing he was breathing heavily. He thought he'd get $600 million, but the amount kept shrinking, and now he was panicking. Why did he waste so much money? He could have bought anything with $600 million, my ex yelled, frustrated. Yelling at me won't change anything. He was happiest when he talked about that time, so he had no regrets. It was his money, and he used it. He planned to repay the debt himself, so no one can complain. You just jumped to conclusions and got ahead of yourself, I replied. Why are you so panicked? I asked. The truth is, I thought I'd get $600 million, so I spent all my own money. My account is empty, he admitted. What? Seriously? I was shocked. My ex-husband had been spending money he didn't even have yet. Now that we were divorced, he couldn't rely on my savings anymore, and he was currently unemployed. I finally understood why he was so panicked. Still, you have a roof over your head and a house, so you can rebuild your life, right? I suggested. I'm almost 54, unemployed, and have only a little savings. What's going to happen to me? Please help me, he pleaded. Me? You have savings and a job, don't you? Why should I help an ex-husband? You're suffering the consequences of your own actions, I said firmly. Please, let's pretend the divorce never happened, he begged, but I ignored his pleas and hung up the phone. Having a careless personality is definitely not a good thing. With that thought, I went back to looking at property listings. Surprisingly, my ex-husband did follow through with the will and gave me $40,000 from my father-in-law's inheritance. That made up for the money he had taken from me. He probably thought it was too much trouble to fuss over $40,000 after dealing with the $600 million situation. He also apparently started working in sales again, but he didn't seem to be taking it seriously. The shock of not getting the $600 million affected his motivation, leading to frequent mistakes. After a month of struggling under the scolding of younger supervisors, he saw his paycheck and lost motivation, comparing it to the $600 million he missed out on. He quit after just a month and is now a part-time worker, barely making enough to get by. But with that, his savings of $600,000 won't increase. In fact, it'll probably decrease. I wonder if he's thinking about his retirement? Well, whatever trouble he gets into now is not my concern. There's no ATM for him anymore. He'll have to work hard. I rented a small condo and started living on my own. I put the $40,000 from my father-in-law into my bank account. I consider it a kind of talisman, so I don't plan on spending it. Seeing it in the account feels like I'm carrying a bit of my father-in-law's work spirit with me, which motivates me. Today, I'll draw strength from him and do my best at work.